No, thank you. Yeah.
Start in a minute. Are there any comments or questions? Or all good? All right. Good. So today we have an important, I think a very important lecture. It's a lecture often overlooked. And I think it's overlooked for all sorts of reasons within sort of Jewish or Israeli identity historically, so this is an important area, and also I think in a way to understand the demonization and the dismissal of Jews in certain parts of the world, the racialization of Jews. It's a very important issue at so many levels. So we're honored to have Isaac Amon here. He's a former legal scholar in The Hague. Worked with ISIS war crimes investigator. He's the director of academic research at the Jewish Heritage Alliance, and he's a lecturer at Washington University School of Law. Today he's going to speak about the Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish experience. Isaac, thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Everyone can hear me? Okay, great. So my plan today is to speak for about 45, 50 minutes to allow the rest of the time for Q&A, for comments, observations, conversation, etc. And I think the goals of this lecture are twofold, kind of piggybacking on what Charles just said. The first is to provide a greater awareness of the global Jewish history and heritage. And the second kind of goes to the same point, because it's important not only in the course of Jewish history, which I think unfortunately, the Sephardic and Mizrahi experience are overlooked even in Jewish spaces in the United States particularly, but also in, again, global discourse on anti-Semitism. And if anyone here is familiar with the term Ashken normative or Ashken normativity, that perceptions, real or imagined, of the Jewish experience, of Jewish culture, Jewish languages, Jewish foods, traditions, etc., it's perceived that the Ashkenazi experience from Central and Eastern Europe is really the norm, and the other traditions, non-Ashkenazi, are seen as somehow exotic or somehow not the norm. And it's time, I believe, to recenter Sephardic and Mizrahi histories and narratives, particularly in this time of surging global anti-Semitism. And so again, for those who don't know the definitions, we have Ashkenazi Jews, and the Hebrew term Ashkenaz means Germany, and over time it came to expand. So Ashkenazi Jews are Jews from Central and Eastern Europe in this region. We have likewise Sepharad, which is the Hebrew term for Spain. And Sephardic Jews are those who have an origin in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, which is of course shaded in the green. And then we have Mizrahi, which is, say, a more recent term, and it's much broader and all-encompassing to basically mean Jews not only, of course, coming from the Mizrach, the Edot HaMizrach, the cities of the east, really east of the Mediterranean, but it's now come to encompass Jews of the North Africa as well, the Maghreb. So really it's the MENA region. Middle East and North Africa today are referred to, again, by and large by this term Mizrahi Jews, though of course there are subsets within this much larger group who all have their own diverse histories. And those stories are worth telling, but obviously I can't do that today in the limited time. Just in passing, I want to say that, of course, I speak on this professionally to a large extent, but I also am driven to do this personally because my family has all three branches. These are my maternal Ashkenazi grandparents. Blessed memory, my grandfather, Henry Hutkin of St. Louis, who actually delivered milk by horse and buggy in the early 20th century, lived through the Great Depression as a young adolescent and adult, fought in the American Army in World War II, fighting fascism, endured anti-Semitism from within his own unit, later fought for civil rights, and his parents came from Belarus and Lithuania, late 19th century. My grandmother, Lillian Rimmer, anglicized to Reuben of Tolchin, Ukraine, who survived a pogrom in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution by hiding in a barrel of hay at the age of 3. And she and her family, her parents, her siblings arrived at Ellis Island in 1922. So in that vast wave of Russian Jews arriving from, say, 1880 to 1924, the 2 million Jews who came. Amon, my surname, is the Sephardic component, and this is a probable ancestor of mine. This is Moses Amon. who was born in Spain and fled in 1492 as a young boy and wound up in Constantinople or Istanbul, where he became the physician, one of them, to the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who is seen here. And this is an engraving actually made of him by a French diplomat in the 1550s when he arrived at the Sublime Porte in Constantinople. And then my paternal grandparents, blessed memory, Dr. Rene Isaac Amon of Istanbul, for whom I'm named, of course, who spoke 7 languages, including Ladino or Judeo-Spanish, the language of the Sephardic exiles. He met Ataturk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, as a teenager, and eventually became a professor of engineering at the University of Illinois in Chicago, or the Circle campus, for those who are familiar with it. And my Mizrahi grandmother, Mrs. Denise Safran Ahmad of Aleppo, or Halab, or the biblical Aram Soba, but really grew up in Beirut, really when World War II broke out, and lived through Beirut of the 1940s, the Paris of the Middle East. She spoke 5 languages, Arabic, although my grandparents really spoke in French to one another, and was a nurse and really a fashionista, and they were married by the chief rabbi, the Hacham Bashi of Turkey in 1952, as the photo shows. And they moved with my dad, who was a little boy, to Chicago in 1957. So bearing these kind of 3 stories, right, these 3 branches in mind, all of them have a common origin in the Levant, in the land of Israel. There is this connection, continuous ties, right, for millennia, historically, spiritually, culturally, etc., beginning already in the time of the legendary Exodus from Egypt, led by Moses in the 14th century BC. And we see, though, that throughout the following centuries, there's the creation of a unified monarchy under King David and his son Solomon, who built the first temple, right, that there is the destruction and already deportation and exile of Jews or Israelites living in this land. The Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, right, in the 10th century, deported the 10 northern tribes who were lost to history. And about a century and a half later, in the 8th century BC, or 6th century BC, I'm sorry, the Babylonians destroyed the first temple, the southern kingdom of Judah, and deported the Judeans, or the Jews, to Babylon, at least most of them, though a remnant remained in the land. And of course, this is famously enshrined in Psalm 137. There by the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept and remembered Zion, or Zion, or the land of Israel. A much more significant event, though, that ultimately led to the creation of distinctive communities, right, throughout the Mediterranean, is the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE by the Romans. Under Titus, on to Shabbat, the Great Day of Lamentation, on the Jewish calendar, which is this coming Sunday. And famously, many Jews were enslaved, taken captive, and the Arch of Titus in Rome today still shows this very vividly. You can see the menorah or candelabra quite prominently on the arch. Thank you. And as a result of the destruction, right, Judaism underwent a dramatic metamorphosis, no more temple, creation really of rabbinic Judaism, again leading to the eventual creation of distinctive communities. And it concludes with one last great revolt, really the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed, according to Roman sources. And very significantly for debates over a Jewish indigeneity to the land, or an ancient Jewish connection to the land, is what happens in the aftermath of this revolt, as we may know. The Emperor Hadrian renamed Judea Syria Palestina, right, renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina, and built the temple to the god Jupiter on the site of the destroyed temple, all in an effort to erase Jewish memory and connection to this land. So really, after the destruction of the Second Temple and Bar Kokhba's revolt, we can say, I think, that a truly Jewish diaspora exile began. And so we'll look first at Sephardic Jews, or Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, about 20, 25 minutes, and then the Mizrahi Jews, which already much has been spoken about in these last few days here. We'll begin with the Visigoths in late antiquity, go through the Middle Ages, and conclude with the Sephardic look in the Holocaust in modern times. So Visigoths, Jewish communities were already present in the Iberian Peninsula by the 1st century of the Roman Empire, when Iberia was a Roman province. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the West in the late 5th century, the Visigoths, a Germanic tribe, came in and conquered the peninsula, initially tolerant of Jews and pagans. Things changed dramatically in 587 when King Recared converted to Catholicism to unify church and state. Anti-Jewish laws were passed almost immediately. And in 613, his successor, King Zizabat, according to the historical record, the details are really sparse, ordered Jews in the Visigothic realm to convert to Catholicism or leave. already, again, at such an early date. And it's estimated this ultimatum impacted as many as 90,000 Jews throughout the Visigothic realm. Many of them appear to have nominally converted to Catholicism, secretly practicing Jewish rites and rituals. Others fled to France or North Africa, hoping that better conditions would soon come. Well, they were disabused of this notion because throughout the 7th century, the Visigothic century, things got worse, enshrined in Visigothic law. It says in the Great Code of the Visigoths, quite openly, we lament that the soil of our kingdom is defiled by the presence of the Jews. Core rituals were forbidden, kashrut, circumcision, Shabbat, and then a very significant clause says Jews, whether baptized or not, are forbidden to testify in court. This was directly contrary to, of course, emerging canon law. It says once converted, right, those who converted would be equal to those born Christian. And this creates what some scholars have called the so-called racialization of religion, this category of baptized Jews, that baptism can never efface already some type of Jewishness that's transmitted from mother to child. And in later times, these effectively same category of people would come to be known as new Christians or conversos, openly Catholic, but still forever identified by their Jewish ancestry, right? New Christians or conversos. This really marks the beginning of the birth of crypto-Judaism as a phenomenon in Iberian or Sephardic history. And the pejorative term that you may know is Marranos, meaning pig or swine. Visigothic rule came to an end in 711 with the Islamic conquest, and this ushered in the so-called golden age of Sepharad or Sephardic Judaism, really in the 200 years, say from the 10th to the 12th century, animated by the so-called spirit of convivencia, of Jews, Christians, and Muslims all living and working together. It's certainly not political or civic equality, as we have learned already this week. Jews and Christians, of course, occupied generally, of course, a lower status. But still, in this relatively tolerant milieu, a number of key individuals came to the fore. Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who served as foreign minister to one of the Umayyad caliphs. Judah Halevi, the great poet and philosopher, who proclaimed, "I live in the West, but my heart is in the East, in the land of Israel." And of course, the towering figure of Maimonides or the Rambam. The lingering vestiges of the Golden Age were ended by Islamists of that time period. The 12th century conquest by the Almohads that Jonathan Spire talked about. The Jews and Christians were forced by the Almohads to convert to Islam, leave or be killed. They abolished dhimmi status. Maimonides, as one of these casualties, fled to North Africa and eventually to Egypt, right, where he became physician to the Sultan Salahuddin in Cairo, or Fustat in old Cairo. Christians and Muslims vied for supremacy, control of the Iberian Peninsula over the following centuries. And by 1350 or so, with the advent of the Black Death or bubonic plague, right, that many Jewish communities across the continent were scapegoated and vilified and massacred. The violence did come to Spain, but more significantly, the date that really shattered Spanish Jewry to a large extent is 1391. As the map shows, riots and massacres erupted against Jewish communities throughout the Spanish kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. It's estimated that up to 100,000 Jews were killed in scores of towns and cities over just a few months. Also significantly, tens of thousands of Jews converted to Catholicism, becoming conversos or new Christians, increasing the ranks, right, of that category of people, increasing questions as to the doubt of the genuine religiosity of these neophytes, but not surprising since, of course, they had basically converted under threat of death. And in 1449, something, again, quite extraordinary happens. For the first time, really in Iberian history, reminiscent of the Visigothic laws, the municipality of Toledo promulgated the purity of blood statutes, known as limpieza de sangre. That is what they themselves called it, targeting conversos on the sole basis of having Jewish ancestry. They were forbidden to hold public office, testify in judicial proceedings, or hold any authority at all over so-called old Christians, those who did not have Jewish forebears. And eventually, these laws, which permeated Spanish and Catholic, or Spanish and Portuguese societies and their colonial empires, meant conversos were barred from admission to universities, religious and military orders. Eventually, it was extremely difficult to even leave the Iberian Peninsula without providing proof you did not have Jewish ancestry. And this culminates with the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478 by papal bull. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella appointed Tomás de Torquemada as the first Grand Inquisitor. And in the 1480s, the first decade of existence, Hundreds of conversos were burnt at the stake for the crime of crypto-Judaism, practicing the Jewish rites, and secret thousands more had their goods and properties confiscated. In the Edict of Expulsion, the Alhambra Decree, announced on March 31st, 1492, called the Alhambra Decree because it came forth from the Alhambra, the citadel and fortress at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in Granada in the south of Spain, today a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This is a copy of the Edict of Expulsion signed by the King and the Queen, some other officials, and embossed with the royal seal, ordering all professing Jews and their progeny to leave forevermore. And this map shows how one single decision made over 500 years ago forever changed the course of Iberian, Jewish, and really world history. The red arrows show the migration of the Spanish Jews, the professing Sephardic Jews who left. They went everywhere throughout the Mediterranean, especially, say, to North Africa. And this is where we see the beginning, really en masse, of Sephardic Jews meeting Mizrahi Jews, right? The already existing Jewish communities in Morocco, in Algeria, in Tunisia, to a lesser extent in Libya, as David Harris and Juju mentioned yesterday, and into the Levant, into the land of Israel, into Syria, into, of course, the heartland of the Ottoman Empire, in Turkey and Greece. Others, actually led by Don Isaac Abravanel, the famous biblical commentator, went to the Italian peninsula. And the black arrows show where the Portuguese Jews, who left in later decades and centuries when they were able to leave, they went to northern and western Europe, including they led the readmission to this very country under Menashe ben Israel in the 1650s, who was born a Portuguese converso. And then eventually they went everywhere throughout the New World. And for the Sephardic Jews, though, who arrived, in the Eastern Mediterranean, you can see they primarily clustered in Istanbul, at least in the Ottoman Empire, and Salonika, the great Greek port city. And here they encountered that other subset of Jewish communities who are not exactly, perhaps, they don't fit exactly neatly into a binary of Sephardic or Mizrahi, but they still existed in much smaller numbers. The Greek or Romaniot Jews, who had been living in Greece perhaps since as early as Alexander the Great. The Roman or Italian Jews since the time of the Maccabees. The Mustarabim, the Jews of the Arab countries. The Kafkazim, Jews of the Caucasus. Teimanim, Jews of Yemen. And Ashkenazim. And so what's fascinating is Ashkenazi Jews arrived, in a sense, earlier than Sephardic Jews did to the Ottoman Empire, at least in larger numbers. And we have here a letter, and it's cut off, I'm sorry, by Rabbi Isaac Sarfati, who came from Germany to Istanbul or Constantinople only 1 year after the Ottomans conquered the city and ended the Byzantine Empire. And he says to his co-religionists living in the Rhineland, in Mainz, Worms, and Speyer, right, the heartland of Ashkenazi Jewry, I proclaim to you that Turkey is a land where nothing is lacking. Is it not better for you to live under Muslims than under Christians? At the western end of the Mediterranean, right, so I said, I think about half of Spanish Jews in 1492 left. The other half, under great duress, converted to Catholicism. And of the half who left and went to North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, the other half of the half, or fourth or so, entered, it appears, neighboring Portugal. They remained on the peninsula. Similar culture, climate, and language. They thought they found a place of refuge, but in December of 1496, the Portuguese King Manuel I ordered his own edict of expulsion. All Jews to convert or leave by October of 1497. And here the story differs dramatically from the Spanish experience because the option to leave was not afforded to the Jews of Portugal. In May or June of 1497, tens of thousands converged in Lisbon, seeking ships on which to leave. They had been promised ships, and when they arrived, they were herded, I should say, into the port, and they were forcibly baptized. It's sometimes called the standing baptism for how quickly it happened. They were forcibly converted and became new Christians overnight. Normative Judaism basically ceased to exist on the Iberian Peninsula at this point. And then Manuel went further, closed synagogues and schools, confiscated books, prayer books, ritual objects, Torah scrolls, and uplifted Jewish cemeteries. This is not only a damnatio memoriae, condemnation of Jewish memory, the erasure, an attempted erasure, but even as one scholar has called it, a religiocide, an attempted annihilation of faith. And so the people of the book, a term that we have been hearing this week, the Al-Kitab, for Jews, they became people of memory, especially in this Portuguese context. Judaism really became, among the conversos who remained on the peninsula, an oral transmission of knowledge centered around the rituals of the home. Women became the primary guardians and teachers of crypto-Judaism in the absence of communal institutions. And crypto-Judaism became extraordinarily entrenched amongst the Portuguese New Christians. Less than a decade later, another key event happened. In April 1506, in Lisbon, during Passover and Easter, famine and plague stalked the Portuguese kingdom, and 2 Dominican priests blamed the New Christians for incurring God's wrath, and a pogrom or a massacre or the slaughter of most of the city's New Christians commenced, and somewhere between 2,000 to 4,000 New Christians were killed, either in the Alfama, in their homes, the traditional Jewish quarter, or they were dragged to the Rocio Square, which is still the heart of the city today, and set in huge bonfires and set alight as depicted in this wood carving. In 1536, the Portuguese Inquisition was created, also by papal bull, along the lines of the Spanish model. And in later decades and centuries, the Portuguese New Christians were able to leave, sometimes surreptitiously, other times legally. And especially throughout the Western Hemisphere, they created these Spanish and Portuguese communities and synagogues, stretching, again, across the Americas, from Recife, Brazil, which was the very first openly professing Jewish community in the 1630s, all the way up to Montreal, Canada. Of course, all along the eastern seaboard of what became the future United States. And many of these communities still endure to this day. And all of them, the names in the Hebrew, evoke a yearning for redemption from inquisitorial persecution, a drive for liberty of conscience, and a hope to return to the land of Israel, to have ultimate salvation. And so this global circuit, really, extraordinary connections amongst conversos and Sephardic Jews, due to the global migration and fleeing persecution, really changed, again, the course of history. This circuit bridged the world, from the Atlantic world to the ancestral Iberian Peninsula, to the Mediterranean, to the Ottoman Empire, to even Iberian colonies in Africa and Asia. And it created multiple and intersecting networks, underpinning this remarkable capacity to cross religious, political, and cultural divides. The Portuguese and Spanish Inquisitions were extremely cognizant of this global migration, unwilling to tolerate heresy at home. They certainly weren't willing to allow them to try to fester their colonies abroad. They established inquisitions around the world in their colonies, tribunals headquartered in Mexico City, in Peru, in Brazil, and in Goa, India. Inquisition had a presence in virtually every ocean on planet Earth. It endured to some extent for 3.5 centuries on 5 continents. This geographical and generational persecution was utterly unprecedented. And it's not unknown in inquisitorial records for, say, 10 generations of one family to have been put under surveillance by the Inquisition. So this, again, is something utterly extraordinary and obviously quite tragic. And again, though, you can see it was very difficult for conversos, let alone crypto-Jews, to find any place of refuge, any respite from persecution. And we can see that the history of this legalized discrimination and enshrined, state intolerance, perhaps we could say anti-Judaism, maybe an early version, in some sense, of anti-Semitism, certainly racialized through the purity of blood laws. The history of this ends only relatively recently. The purity of blood laws themselves, look at the years they're abolished. Portugal, the time of the American Revolution. Spain, the American Civil War. The Inquisitions themselves are abolished only 200 years ago. And the 1492 Edict of Expulsion is officially rescinded by Spain in 1968, after the Six-Day War. And perhaps the most tragic denouement to this story is the impact of the Shoah on the direct descendants of the Iberian Jews and conversos, who had fled and found places of haven. The Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam had arrived already in the late 1500s, early 1600s. They built a magnificent synagogue, or synagogue, that still stands today, celebrating its 350th anniversary this year. When the Nazis arrived, of course, Dutch Jewry was shattered. 75% were killed, the highest rate in Western Europe. The Dutch Jewish community, or the Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam, I should say, was deported to Auschwitz, 42 to 44. The picture is of the chief rabbi, Eliyahu Frances, and his wife, the Rabisa Diamante Tazartes, who were murdered there. And so for the Portuguese community, which was only maybe 4,000 or 5,000 Jews, the death rate was 90 to 95% in the Shoah. Likewise, for Salonika, Greece, direct descendants of the 1492 Ladino-speaking Spanish exiles, They arrived in Salonika, it became the great Greek port on the city. Ladino was the lingua franca of the entire city, even into the 20th century. The Nazis arrived in 1941, and within 6 months of 43, the culmination, they deported 50,000 Ladino-speaking Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where they all almost perished in the gas chambers. The Aristotle University today in Salonika is built directly on top of the destroyed Jewish cemetery. Less than 2,000 Salonican Jews survived the Nazi onslaught, including the parents of Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer. The death rate in Salonika was also 96%. And as well, look at these small communities in the Eastern Mediterranean and Aegean. Leros had 1 Jew, Daniel Rachamim. Kos had 100 Jews, Crete 300, Rhodes 1,600, Corfu 1,700. They were deported in 1944. After the Hungarian Jews were sent to Auschwitz by Eichmann, they are the last Jews basically to be deported. The Nazis were well aware the Allies were rapidly advancing on both fronts, and yet they still actually sent men, personnel, resources to ship these small communities to Auschwitz as well, where they almost all perished. And I was just in Auschwitz about a month ago for a conference, but of course I had to bear witness and say the Kaddish and the Omali Rachamim for those who were departed. And so turning our attention now to the Mizrahi Jews, those who did not undergo an inquisition, the purity blood laws, right? The Jews really living along the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean, but of course an ancient provenance, living in a heartland of, say, Jewish civilization, side of the famed Babylonian Talmudic academies, of course, which is indispensable to rabbinic Judaism. We see, as we have been talking about for this entire week, the concept of dimitude, a legalized discrimination and inferiority. Of course, Mizrahi Jews lived through European colonization and the surge of Arab nationalism that basically ended in these countries, in these places, right, the ancient Jewish communities within living memory. And we'll look at just a few brief case studies. Of course, this is the map of the MENA region. Again, you can see it's vast, it's broad. It stretches, again, across the Mediterranean. We can only look at a few countries. But let's begin. Again, it's already been covered. I know by Rick even earlier today, the Jews already lived in Arabia well before the Second Temple was destroyed. In 610 CE, Muhammad claimed revelation from Allah via the angel Gabriel. It's written down into what becomes the Quran, accompanied by the Hadith. In 622 CE, the famous year of the Hijrah, Muhammad flees Mecca to Medina. 3 Jewish tribes live there. They welcome him, but they don't convert to Islam. There's some political and religious tension. And by 629 CE, so even within the lifetime of the Prophet, the Jewish tribes living there are expelled, enslaved, or killed. And this, of course, we see the expansionist period following the death of the Prophet. Although he had already expanded greatly within Arabia itself, we see the beginning of the caliphates, the Rashidun, the first 4 successors, right, to the Prophet himself, followed by the Umayyads based in Damascus, the Abbasid in Baghdad, famously the Ottomans in Istanbul. And you can see how they Islamicize and come to Arabize basically the entire MENA region. So the Jews, of course, is one of the earliest peoples of antiquity who survived antiquity, right? They witness this entire process unfolding. But many of the caliphs themselves, right, are extraordinarily cosmopolitan. They value Jewish contributions. There are some Christian rulers who do as well. And this little anecdote shows, I think, that concept. We have here the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, right, based in Aachen, who actually corresponded directly with the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid. And Rashid is famous because he's depicted in 1001 Nights, or Arabian Nights. And they wrote and sent gifts to one another, including a clock, which was a technological marvel for its time, and in animals, including an elephant named Abul Abbas. This is according to the historical record. And the delegation of Charlemagne from Aachen to Baghdad was led by one Isaac the Jew of Narbonne. Now, I like this, not only because, of course, he shares the same name, but because I think it genuinely shows the contributions that Jews can make to these cultures, to these civilizations when they're permitted to do so, and that Jews can truly serve as a bridge between Christendom and the Dar al-Islam. And in terms of the concept of dimitude, again, as we know, Jews and Christians, some others are referred to as the people of the book, the Ahlul Kitab. They have to pay a special type of tax, a poll tax, known as jizya, in exchange for official state protection of their ability to practice their faith. Unimpeded, they're granted internal autonomy, really typified by the millet system in the Ottoman Empire. But above all, it's predicated upon an acknowledgement of a subservient second-class status. It's a structural system of inequality enshrined in law. And yet, as we know, as has been said by other speakers, and as the letter of Rabbi Isaac Sarfati, right, he wrote to his Ashkenazi co-religion, says, many Jews still prefer to live under this system than under Christian rule. Nonetheless, even within, again, that many caliphs or clerics, right, chose to interpret how vigorously, right, dhimmi status. It varied from time to time and place to place. There were restrictions on clothing and building codes, sense of humiliation perhaps, but again, for many Jews it was seen as a better place, more tolerant place than Christian rule. Officially, dhimmitude seems to have ended in the Ottoman Empire in 1856 as part of the Tanzimat reforms of the Ottoman Empire. It's an imperial edict by the Sultan Abdul-Mejid I, who was seen at the top. But the effects lasted into the 20th century, till the end of the Ottoman Empire, which collapsed after the First World War into when Ataturk, is seen here, the founder of the Turkish Republic, abolished the Ottoman Sultanate in 1922 and the Caliphate itself in 1924. And so bearing all this history in mind, ladies and gentlemen, we now turn to the case studies of just a handful of countries, because again, we can't cover everything, and there will always be nuances and exceptions, right, within countries, within communities, perhaps family to family, but I think it provides a general pattern. So we'll look at Algeria, Libya, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Iran, and we'll conclude. Algerian Jewry in North Africa, present since at least Roman times, the 1st century of the Common Era, clustered in the major urban centers of Algiers, Constantine, and Oran. In the 7th century, Jews fleeing the Visigothic persecutions, as aforementioned, arrived in Algeria. They witnessed the Islamic conquest of North Africa and Iberia. In 1391, fleeing the massacres throughout the Spanish kingdoms, as we also talked about, Sephardic Jews fled as well to North Africa, including Algeria, and in this case, 2 famous sages, Isaac ben Sheshet, the Rivash, and Shimon ben Semach Doran, the Rashbats, who in turn became chief rabbi of Algiers. In 1830, right in the wave of European colonization, and the beginning of it for much of, say, Africa and even beginning of Asia, we see in North Africa the French occupy Algeria, and they literally annex it. It becomes an integral part of metropolitan France. It becomes indispensable, in a sense, to French identity. It becomes known as Algérie Française. And in 1870, the famous Crémieux Decree is promulgated, granting French citizenship to almost all Algerian Jews. This places many Jews already within a weird position, because now the colonizer has declared them to be part, in the sense of their society, and so many Algerian Muslims become more resentful of the Jews who were granted this citizenship, even though they didn't ask for it. What's interesting is in this case, it was French Jews who believed in that mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. They wanted to embrace Algerian Jews, to wrench them into modernity, to kind of wean away their superstitious beliefs. And in the 20th century, the situation deteriorates and ends for Algerian Jewry. A pogrom erupts in the city of Constantine in 1934. At least 25 Jews were killed, businesses, homes destroyed. And in 1940, Vichy France, administering the country, as one of its very first acts, revokes the Crémieux Decree. So up to 130,000 Jews lose their French citizenship immediately. Children are expelled from schools. They're forced to wear an ID. Their property is Aryanized. 2,000 Jews, it appears, are even sent to internal forced labor camps in Algeria. And yet, many of these Algerian Jews, it's a larger conversation, they still feel a connection to the French. They feel that Vichy France is a perversion, a corruption of the genuine France of 1789, of liberty, equality, fraternity. And in the aftermath of the Algerian War of Independence, when Algeria becomes independent in 1962, they actually mandate, in order to be a citizen, you have to have a Muslim father or grandfather. Well, this thus excludes the 100,000 Algerian Jews who have been living there, right, since antiquity. And so at this point, they leave. They're basically forced to, and they go mostly to France, 100,000, about 10,000 or so go to Israel. In Libya, again, where Juju, and David Harris spoke about yesterday, Jews were present since at least the 4th century BCE. In 1911, Italy colonized the country, again, as part of the colonization process. And they tried to Italianize the country in language and mores and fashion. It's estimated about 40,000 Jews lived there, majority in the capital, Tripoli. In 1941, also during World War II, the Italians had imposed the racial laws of 1938 on Tripoli, and the Jews of Libya are impacted as well in the fighting between the British and the Germans in North Africa. Tripoli is also Jewish to a very high percentage, as we see up to 25%. And we have thousands of Libyan Jews who are also deported to forced labor camps, an internal concentration camp, also notoriously Jado, and over 550 died due to horrific conditions in the desert. Pogroms erupt again, 1945, 1948. Hundreds of Jews are killed, the synagogues and homes are destroyed, and then in 1967, in the wake of the Six-Day War, pogroms erupt once more, as Juju spoke about. The population had already declined to about 7,000. They basically all leave, leaving only 100 to remain when Gaddafi came to power in 1969. Gaddafi, as one of his first moves in power, confiscated all Jewish property, canceled all debts owed to them. The remainder left, and in 2003, the very last known living Jew in a nursing home was permitted to go to Italy, thus leaving no Jews in a country where they had been living for 2,500 years. In Iraq, Jews have been present since the destruction of the first temple, as we talked about. The site of the famed Talmudic academies of Sura and Pumbedita near modern-day Fallujah. The Arabs conquered in the 7th century. Islam became the state religion. Dhimmitude was imposed, though of course again it varied from caliph to caliph, though one caliph in particular, al-Mutawakkil, was noted for particular animus toward dhimmi. And still, in the 20th century, less than 100 years ago, Iraq still had 130,000 Jews. Baghdad itself was up to 1/3 Jewish, a comparable percentage to Krakow and Warsaw in the same time period. In 1941, the notorious Farhud occurred, as David Patterson mentioned yesterday. Riots, massacres, looting of the Jewish community. Of course, local anti-Semitism, further instigated, exacerbated by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini. Hundreds of Jews are killed, 1,000 are injured, an unknown number of rapes. It's massive violence and terror on a scale unprecedented in Iraqi Jewish history. It's something that sends ripple waves throughout the city, country, and the region, and as a final confirmation of an Iraq that is gaining, will gain independence soon from British rule. The case of Shafiq ad-Dass is the confirmation there's no place for Jews in Iraqi society. Shafiq ad-Dass, who is seen here, was the wealthiest Jew in the country. He had extensive connections, wealth, influence. A few months after Israel declared independence, he was arrested and charged with spying for Israel. He was never permitted to see the evidence against him. He was denied the right to have counsel, Kafkaesque, inquisitorial-esque. His entire estate, worth millions, was confiscated, and he was hanged publicly before 12,000 people in Basra. And this shatters any remaining hope the Iraqi Jews have. Within just 3 years, 120,000 flee and are airlifted to Israel in Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. And the remaining few who linger on into the 60s then suffer through the Ba'ath Party and a young Saddam Hussein who came to power, and their assets are confiscated, lose jobs, and dozens more are hanged after the Six-Day War. Less than a handful of Jews in the country today. For Syrian Jews, tradition has maintained for a long time. They've been there since King David himself. The major centers were Aleppo, where my own grandmother was from, Damascus, and Kamishli. The 11th century Sephardic traveler Benjamin of Tudela, sometimes called the Jewish Marco Polo, though he lived 100 years before Marco Polo, visited the Mediterranean and the Levant. And in 1492, Spanish and Portuguese Jews fleeing the Edict of Expulsion arrived in Syria, and also integrated to a great degree, so that it's estimated actually about 50% of Aleppo Jews today, the Halabi Jews, actually descend from Iberian Jews and conversos who came in the aftermath of 1492. This has also been mentioned by the speakers this week, and that is the Damascus blood libel affair, which of course occurred in Syria in 1840, also as part of, say, a European-style importation of classical anti-Semitism and the blood libel trope. The Jewish community of Damascus was accused of killing an Italian monk and his servant to use the blood for baking matzah and Passover. The accused were subjected to brutal torture. Over 60 Jewish children were taken hostage to compel their parents to disclose the location of the bodies. The ancient Jobar synagogue was pillaged. The laws of the scroll were desecrated. What's significant is not the violence, but the response. For the first time, Jewish kind of unity occurs around the globe. A delegation is actually led by Sir Moses Montefiore of this United Kingdom, as well as Adolphe Crémieux of France, the man who, of course, promulgated the Crémieux Decree. They go to the Ottoman Empire, ended up meeting with the Ottoman Sultan Abdul-Majid I, the same sultan who would later abolish the dhimmi status, because you see this is 1840 and the dhimmi status abolished in 1856. And after examining the evidence, he categorically declared the blood libel had no foundation in truth. And for American Jewry, it's significant because for the first time, U.S. Jews spoke on behalf of diasporic brethren. They actually protested and met with the administration of President Martin Van Buren. And in 1947, similar to the other communities, this occurred in the wake of the partition vote, right, to partition mandatory Palestine. The Aleppo community is destroyed. Synagogues, homes, the Great Synagogue is seen at the top, its destruction. My own family was impacted. The house and coffee shop, Cafe Turquoise, was looted and set on fire. My great uncle, who just died last year, smuggled himself out of Aleppo using a Muslim friend's ID to get into Israel. And the Assad regime, the father and son duo, right, for the Jews who lived under them, the bank accounts were frozen, surveilled with to an incredible extent by secret police. Majority left in the 90s under immense U.S. pressure. Today, again, only a handful or so in the country. And concluding here, next few slides, turning now just to look at the two great non-Arab Islamic countries in the region, Turkey, right? Heir to the Ottoman Empire, heir to a place that had welcomed the Jews fleeing the 1492 expulsion. We see, though, even in the early republic, there is anti-Semitism present. There is discrimination against non-Muslims. In 1934, pogroms erupted against the Jews of Thrace, or European Turkey, particularly the city of Edirne and Çanakkale or Gallipoli, and they were forced to leave. About 15,000 Jews left for Istanbul. And then in 1942, in World War II, a wealth tax was imposed. The Varlık Vergisi, predominantly on non-Muslims, they had to pay an incredibly high percentage of their income within 15 days. If they couldn't pay, there was no appeal process. And if they couldn't pay, they were sent to forced labor camps in eastern Anatolia. And we know about 5,000 non-Muslims were actually sent there. And then in 1955, riots occurred in Istanbul, initially directed against the Greeks, but of course it came to impact Armenians and Jews. And following this, my own grandparents living in Istanbul with my dad, who was a little boy, said this was the end. They did not see a future for Jews in Turkey, and they thus moved to Chicago. Today, about 14,000 Jews in the country, 12,000 in Istanbul, the remaining 2,000 say in Izmir and Ankara. And Iran. Obviously, we're all familiar with it, in a place where Jews have been living since antiquity. It is documented in the book of Esther that we commemorate and read every Purim. Jews suffered to a great extent under Shia rule, especially during the Safavid dynasty that declared the Jews to be najis, or unclean, or polluters. By the time of the Pahlavi dynasty in 1925 that sought to secularize Iran, just like Ataturk was doing to Turkey, the Jews were actually somewhat relatively safe, secure, certainly vis-a-vis what happened to their Jewish brethren in Arab countries, especially under the rule of the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah. And as we know, in 1979, with the advent of the Islamic Revolution and Ayatollah Khomeini, the Shah was toppled, fled into exile, died a year later. Up to 100,000 Jews were still living in the country. And in a chilling parallel to what happened to Iraq, to Shafiq Hades, Habib al-Ghani, the leader of the community, was also charged with spying for Israel, declared in the parlance of the Islamic Republic an enemy of God, and executed. I believe he was the very first civilian executed by the Islamic Republic in a trial that lasted 20 minutes. Tens of thousands of Iranian Jews fled, especially coming to the United States, to Los Angeles, to Baltimore, other places. Today we know about 9,000 Jews or so still live in the country, again under extreme surveillance, restrictions, very perilous situation. So all in all, ladies and gentlemen, the 20th century for the Jews of Mina, for Mizrahi Jews, we could say it's the forgotten Jewish Nakba. It was a catastrophe. It was an end to a millennia-old story. 850 to 900,000 Jews lived in these lands just 70, 80 years ago. Today, there's a few thousand at most, and even if we include Turkey and Iran, the number is no more than 25,000. The Knesset declared November 30th to be the national day of commemoration for the Jews expelled from these countries, and the majority, where did they go? United States, France, Israel. But as we know, even when they sought to come to the nascent state of Israel, there were still issues: lack of infrastructure, ability to absorb the immigrants. They had to construct what were known as Ma'abarot, the temporary refugee or transit camps. Hundreds of thousands came. This is a picture, I believe, of Yemenite Jews housed in one of the camps. You can see, though, even in 1951, so say 250,000 Jews living in over 100 camps, 75% were Mizrahi Jews, only 18% were European, which could probably be read as Ashkenazi Jews. So there's already seen by many this disparity between how these Jews are received by the state of Israel. So this fuels a sense of resentment, I believe, at the perceived Ashkenazi elitism, Ashkenazi leadership, the poor conditions in the camps, etc. But it also led to, I think, a resurgence of pride in their Mizrahi identity. And it certainly helped to power Likud to political power under Menachem Begin in 1977 and formation of Shas, political party, in 1984. And 50% of Israeli Jews today identify as Sephardi and Mizrahi, if not more. And I think one of the great understandings of the experience of Jews of really Arab countries, of the MENA region, was by the late Elberich Memmi, Tunisian, French, Jewish public intellectual who lived at the intersection, perhaps the contestation of multiple identities. As he put it, we would have liked to be Arab Jews, but Muslim Arabs over centuries prevented this by their contempt and cruelty. It's now too late for us to become Jews. He wrote this in 1975, to become Arab Jews. You will not find a single Arab Jew who will agree to return to his native land. So what are the take-home points, I think, ladies and gentlemen? Well, they're these. Anti-Semitism, as we know, is not just European, Christian, or Holocaust-centered. And actually, it's one of the great things about ISGAP, right, is that so many people think of Holocaust immediately as anti-Semitism. That's a problem. And that's why it's so important to talk about these other stories, narratives, especially throughout the long arc of history. It's structural, it's global. In many cases, it's an erasure of Jewish history and memory. Of course, many of these communities live on in the diaspora in the United States and Israel, but in the places where they lived, it's no more. And the memory there has vanished to a great extent. Sephardic and Mizrahi history, I believe, can effectively challenge anti-Semitic and inverted narratives that all Jews are white, that all Jews have no connection to this region, that they've never been here. And my favorite, of course, that all Jews come from Poland and should go back there. In the wake of October 7th, many Jews in the United States and Europe, I think, feel somewhat fearful to openly express Jewish identity. Could this be considered a surge of crypto-Judaism? I certainly perhaps see a parallel to the Iberian crypto-Jewish experience. And in Holocaust education, especially in the United States, could we be doing a better job to talk about the impact on North Africa and the utter annihilation of Salonika and Rhodes? Far too many museums don't mention this. And above all, we should see ourselves within the continuity of Jewish history, that stories of Baghdad and Aleppo and Algiers are no less significant and indispensable to the Jewish story than Warsaw and Krakow. And I'll leave the final words with the late Simon Dubnow, the great Ashkenazi Jewish historian murdered by the Nazis. He put it, every generation in Israel carries within itself the remnant of worlds created and destroyed during the course of the history of the Jewish people. And that generation in turn continues to weave the thread that binds all the links of the nation into the chain of generations. We, the people of Israel living today, continue the long thread from the days of Abraham to our own time. His final words in the Riga ghetto before he was murdered, according to eyewitnesses, were, "Jews, if you survive, write and record, Yidden schreibt and verschreibt." Well, I think that all of us, singularly at our home institutions and communities, collectively here, we are doing just that. We are writing, we are recording, we are speaking, and we won't forget. Thank you very much. Yeah, no.
Questions? I can't ask any questions, but everybody's here. too, and feel free to be brief because I know there's a lot of questions. Albert Benny, who I had the wonderful fortune of hanging out with him in Israel before he passed, he said that there's no Jew from an Arab land would ever go back. Jews in North Africa, the Middle East, have been expunged, and they're in Israel. Israel is the only other, the Jewish people are the only other to have self-determination in that region, and there is an Islamist and now Western anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist movement from the river to the sea that wants to annihilate this only, not only democracy, but this only other space of self-determination. So given your, laying out Jewish history from the perspective of the Mizrahi Sephardic experience, number one, how do you perceive this genocidal movement to rid the world of this Jewish self-determination? Number one. Number two, for the assimilated American Jews, for the Jews who sit and pontificate about how Zionism and the Jewish self-determination affects them in America, in the Ivy League institutions, or their experience in Oxbridge, and how it interferes with them, and how they have this sort of moral angst. What can this history teach the assimilated American Jew? And I say American Jew specific because I don't know of another diaspora where the anti-Zionism and the fear has become so entrenched in the public and communal discourse. It reminds me of the Soviet Union of the 70s and 80s, actually. So from your lens, could you please address these two questions? Thank you.
Those are, of course, great questions. In terms of the genocidal movement, I would agree. Of course, I understand that term, the phraseology, river to the sea, or I guess as it translated in Arabic as from the water to the water, to be a call to rid, of course, the state of Israel, to annihilate it, and also to prevent the self-determination of the Jewish people. And in terms, I think, of how this history, I think it shows that, and in terms of the assimilated American Jews, we can live in a place for so long, or Jews can, and minorities can for that matter, and things can change dramatically in a moment, in an instant. My grandparents used to always tell me, I'll just add it personally, they told me never trust anyone. My grandmother from Aleppo, my grandfather from Istanbul told me keep your head down, don't make waves, don't speak out. I always thought, why is he so afraid? Why are they telling me not to, trust people that I think are friends? And they said, now I understand. It's because of those lived experiences. Things changed dramatically for those Sephardic Mizrahi Jews. These were lands, again, they've been living for centuries, millennia. Really, we could say Ashkenazi Jews too, lived in Poland for 1,000 years. So in a sense, it's really no different. But I think you're right that America is as great as it's been. And I do believe even the founding, to a large extent, has been fairly unique in terms of the extraordinary commitment to religious liberty, especially for Jews. Things can change there, and we see they are changing there. And once it happens in discourse, we're already seeing it, I think, a change happening in establishment and institutional levels. And eventually that's, I think, what leads to changes in the law. And I'll just add one other thing quickly, that I was speaking to someone just a few weeks ago, and she, of course, is wondering now, are American Jews in a similar situation to where Jews were in Germany in the 30s? I don't know, but her point was, she said, when something, say, discriminatory is enshrined in law, that's the end of the process, right? Not the beginning of the discrimination. So she said, do we need to wait to be in a place where nothing's enshrined, right? Nothing is legally discriminatory against Jews? She said, I don't want to wait till the end to get to a point where we have Nuremberg laws. So I say those are my points, that we should learn from this history, and this provides, again, a very vital point that it can happen to Jews everywhere, in any culture, in any civilization. And I think that's a constant. We have to be ready to go wherever. But it also showcases their incredible Jewish resilience amidst everything across time and space.
Thanks.
you so much for a very, very informative presentation. That was really, really interesting and something that I haven't really heard much about. I would like to push back, or at least hear your take on the notion that Sephardi/Mizrahi Jews challenge the anti-Semitic narrative of Jews as white. So I do a research study where we interview participants and professors about their experiences with anti-Semitism on Canadian campuses. One participant who is Judeo-Arab, they mentioned that on an individual level, they are not seen as white, but when they recently attended to rescue one of their students from an anti-Israel protest, and that student is also, half Arab, then they were, someone screamed at them, go back to Poland, despite them not looking at all like they belong in Poland. So I think Mizrahi Jews can individually be seen as not white, but collectively Jews are seen as white. And it comes with these connotations of being, an oppressor, an imperialist, etc. So I'd love to hear your take on this. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. You're right. I mean, it's not going to convince everyone. Although I think that, again, if a person's prepared maybe to talk and to have discourse, you could have progress made. But obviously in certain spaces where they're parroting talking points, they're not willing to obviously engage in this discourse, they have, say, an agenda, it's not going to work. But I think it's more, in a space, again, where people are willing to come and learn and to see it. I think that's what I mean, more at the kind of either the one-on-one conversations or in a space where people would come together in a place like this, and you could kind of show and say, wow, not all Jews are from Poland. Again, not that I think there's anything wrong with that either. I'm also half, right? From, Ukraine and everywhere else. But I think more, again, in a place where people are willing to come and learn. But you never know, I think, in telling these stories, who it could impact. Even people are on the far left and that type of discourse. They might actually change their minds if they're maybe willing to think about it a little bit.
Hi, thanks so much for this. I think it really teases together some of the pieces that I've learned, but seeing it presented very sort of cohesively in the historical elements I think is really helpful. I wanted to ask, you started the session talking about Ashken normativity and ended speaking in part about Sephardic and Mizrahi experiences needing to be considered in Holocaust education and anti-Semitism education. And I was just curious if you've seen changes in recent years, with the rise, including of the term sort of Ashken normativity, or where you see sort of where this is going, any sort of work on that.
So is this specific to the Holocaust context, or?
Holocaust, or just including what is anti-Semitism? I just learned the Farhud, for example. I just learned that term a year ago, which I was like, oh, I should have known this term. I've never, curious if you're seeing changes, progress. There's a lot more visible with social media of, I think, Middle East, North African Jews now that Ashkenazi Jews maybe have access to, but I don't know if that's your perspective or not, but I'm curious what you think about what it means to expand these things, and if you're seeing any changes.
Okay, thanks again for that question. I think that's very important. I would agree, social media, there's definitely been much more of a surge, I think, on talking about the Sephardic and Mizrahi context. I see that a lot. Now, I also tend to follow a lot of organizations that are talking about it, so is it kind of the self-fulfilling type of prophecy? But I have noticed that I've seen, I think, more programs in different places and institutions, sometimes museums, though I have to say there's still, to me, sometimes in some places a remarkable degree of resistance to talking about this type of stuff. One Holocaust museum in particular I want to share, I won't say the name, but I was there maybe a year or two ago. I went through the core exhibition, and there's not a single mention of Sephardic or Mizrahi Jews. And I went to one of the docents.
No, turn it off. No, you had it right. Turn it off. This was. Okay, this should work. No.
And yeah.
Thank you.
And I went to one of the docents, and I have to tell you, when I said, how come you don't even mention, you have a single sentence in the chronology on the deportation of Salonican Jews to Auschwitz. You have the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, you go right to Treblinka revolt in August, so May to August, followed by Sobibor. And I understand those are major events, but I said, could we just mention Salonican Jews? And he looked at me and he said, what's Salonika? Followed by when I spoke with the director of education, and I brought this to her attention and said, could we do something about this or at least have a program? She said, well, I know about the story, but it's not of interest. I thought that the Holocaust museums were supposed to talk about every aspect, especially this. I think the one other thing I'll mention, by the way, knowing this history shows even how deep-seated the anti-Semitism is, how even more, and how deep-seated the Shoah was meant to be. It's only because of the Allied landings in North Africa, right? Operation Torch, that the Jewish communities in North Africa, I think, were saved, and Rommel's victory at El Alamein, that prevented the Nazis from going into the land of Israel. The 100 Days of Terror is called.
You mean, you said Rommel's victory, you meant?
I'm sorry, Montgomery's victory. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, God forbid. Rommel's defeat at El Alamein by Monty that saved the Jews of the Levant and the Middle East, again in tandem with the American landings there. So it's very important. I'm seeing somewhat of a change. I don't think, obviously, it's happening fast enough that I would like, but at least it's a step in the right direction. And I think as we continue to face this, I would want to hope this anti-Semitism and this growing awareness, there are these other diverse Jewish stories and narratives, this can help educate people. And it's also doing justice to the victims.
Next week we have Professor Medoff from the Wyman Center. And Professor Wyman famously wrote this book, The Abandonment of the Jews. So the American Air Force was 30 seconds away from bombing the railroad tracks to Auschwitz, and knowingly did not. So that will be next week.
I think this was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. I think you did a better job of making the case for why Jews need self-determination in their own homeland than all of the Holocaust education that we've been getting for 50 years. Okay, 2 questions and then 1 pseudo question. One question is, when you're tracing how the Sephardic Jews are migrating after the expulsions from Spain and Portugal, some of them are ending up in Europe. Then they become Ashkenazic Jews? That's a question. So then they become Ashkenazic Jews is my understanding, and that's confusing to me, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Number 2, a couple times you did specify, like when you talked about the pogrom in Syria, that it was based on the accusation of the killing of the Christian monk, the Italian monk. I'm wondering, you went through a litany of examples of massacres of Jews throughout the Arab world, and I'm wondering to what extent those were based on blood libel, or blood libel that looks like the blood libel of Europe, or other false accusations against Jews. And then the last thing, and it goes to kind of one of your responses already, where you even paused to say like, well, yeah, I'm also like this, I have my own personal concern about how, and I find myself doing it all the time, but all Israelis aren't white, or this Jew isn't white, that Jew's more brown than this Jew. And we're doing it in order to appease a incredibly racist framework for valuing humans based on their perceived oppression, based on assumptions about history related to race, some of which are true, but others are not. And I just kind of wonder about us doing this, and it feels also similar to another thing that we've said many times here, which is it starts with the Jews, but it doesn't end with the Jews, which Dara Horn has criticized for, like, why isn't it good enough that there are going to be dead Jews? So similar to that, like, why isn't it good enough that people are hating on Jews? Why does it also have to be that we are brown or black, or why can't it just be that we're Jews?
Thanks for the questions. There's a lot there. In terms of the Sephardic Jews, you said going to Europe. So it is possible. See, this is where it gets nuanced, and I can only we can only do so much, as we know, right, in a limited time. So when the Sephardic Jews went to Europe, say the Spanish and Portuguese, right, they established their own communities, whether that's Amsterdam, whether it's London. The Spanish Portuguese that dates to the time of Cromwell, and then the Restoration that the current Spanish Portuguese synagogue dates from, right? So they're not Ashkenazi. They retain as Spanish and Portuguese Jews, Western Sephardim they're called. This is the problem potentially, but also within Sephardic, is the 1492 expulsion created that complete diaspora, really two diverging paths. You have the North African ones who go to North Africa, of course, and really integrate into those communities. Then you have Eastern, who go to the Ottoman Empire and the Levant, and that's where they bring the Ladino, right, the Judeo-Spanish that takes up other languages. And then in sheer numbers, they overwhelm so many of the local communities. Aleppo is the one great example, actually, that resists, and it's where the Sephardic Jews actually adopt much more of the local liturgy and customs and language. So Ladino was, for example, not spoken as much in Aleppo as it was elsewhere. Aleppo Jews are very proud, still are, of their identity. In fact, one of my great uncles used to tell me, I'm not Sephardi, even just a few years ago. He says, I'm Mizrahi, I'm Halabi. He always say this. He doesn't want to be from Iberian stock. He says, I'm not. So it's a completely different understanding. So they didn't become Ashkenazi, they did maintain their own communities. It is possible that maybe they went to places that over time they stayed. Many more Ashkenazi Jews came, and in the process, in later decades or centuries really, they did adopt Ashkenazi customs and just retained a memory that they had Sephardic forebears. We see this too. Ashkenazi Jews did go to Mizrahi countries. Small numbers, but there were Ashkenazi Jews, for example, in the Ottoman Empire, as I mentioned, even in Egypt. So yes, they can speak Arabic, but they still retain an Ashkenazi, identity. In terms of, you said the blood libel of Damascus, yes, that is very much, it seems to be an importation of the classical blood libel, but the French consul actively pushed it, Rafi Menton. He pushed it, he really believed the Jews, I think, to be guilty of it, and so he was anti-Semitic and influenced a whole host of opposition to Jews, and of course this is egged on by the Greeks. It's also a sense of rivalry, I think, between minorities at times, and it's easy to accuse Jews, especially by the late 19th century, that there have been blood libels in the past in the Ottoman Empire. The firmans had already been issued, even in the time of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 1500s, that there's no truth at all. So there were much fewer, very, very few and in between, as compared to, say, Ashkenazi lands. And in terms of, you said white, I would agree. I mean, I say it because if someone wants to push back and say all Jews are white, you say, well, it's not true. But you're right in a broader concept, I think, that saying that Jews, if not all Jews are white, maybe implies that the Jews who are white are actually oppressors in the binary and that understanding, and that is something to push back. But I'm talking about maybe in a particular case or conversation where someone just says all Jews are white and go to Poland or from Poland, we should say that's not true. But your larger point stands.
And I'm just going to intervene very quickly. I think it's a very specific American issue. Even growing up in Canada and Quebec, not far away, even though many Americans don't know where Quebec or Canada is, the white people were people who were the founding fathers, and I'm choosing my words carefully, the founding fathers of Confederation were the British and French. And the Jews were other, we were Jewish. We never perceived ourselves as white. It's a very American issue. The United States is profoundly racialized. And I think those of us who were doing the conversation yesterday should be mindful of this. And it drives me nuts that the response, as you were saying, of American Jews is, well, yeah, we're white, but there's some brown people and black people and Ethiopian people, and we wheel out this sort of multicultural mosaic, and there's pictures, and it drives me nuts. At ISGAP, we're starting a Jewish consciousness research project based on the anti-apartheid movement of Stephen Biko. My mentor, Linda Blanchet's mentor, was Shenge Raghavan, who, in his words, conscientized Stephen Biko, and they helped to create the Black Consciousness movement, which basically, Black consciousness understood that the European definitions of black and white, of superior and inferior, emptied Africans of everything of their culture and just portrayed them as inferior and black. They went back to Zulu and Xhosa culture, their connection to the land, their cosmology. And the Jewish people, as I said the other day, we have right here, we have it all here. We're very fortunate. The wisdom is a touch away. And we understand from a Jewish perspective who we are, how we're a people, how we're supposed to perceive and be ethical to the other. We have profound wisdom. And I think particularly in the United States with this onslaught of anti-Semitism at universities and in the educational system, we have to reconnect to our wisdom and stop allowing our enemies to define us. Stop allowing our enemies to define us. And go back to our knowledge, and I think collect ourselves, figure out who we are, where we are, and then how do we define ourselves and how do we resist this onslaught against us in the United States, in higher education, in these liberal spaces. So anyways, that's my 2 cents. Good. Thank you.
Thank you. We touched upon it before about social media. I think what's really been amazing before 10/7 and after is the amount of voices on social media of Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews. And you mentioned that you follow a lot of profiles, as do I. And I think it's been social media, I know that's not very academic, but it's been a really great tool and opportunity for these voices to reach people who have no idea. And I kind of say this as, I'm not a professor, but for those in the room, you are, when we're, I hate to use combating, but these voices, we're not fighting logic, we're fighting stories, and I think that's where social media can really help, like, your students is of sharing stories, sharing these resources that I know are not academic, but are authentic and their truths. So I'm really curious on what organizations and what influencers you are following on social media that might be really beneficial.
What social media?
Yeah, great. No, no, I think there's accuracy to your point. I do think people can learn depending on who it is that they're following. They can learn little tidbits and little facts, much more than like enrolling in a class or going to read a tome. Obviously, it's not for everyone. That's why I also think the public programming and outreach to the public is essential, whether that's like adult education, whether that's to communities, places of worship, Jewish, not Jewish. So, and I already do, by the way, just personally, I try to do a lot of that anyway, because I think that's where we get a lot of the, I think the richest reward of people understanding and learning. And in terms of, for social media, like for example, one of the good organizations is called Jimena, So I myself was a scholar with them. I was one of their early national cohort members. But I follow. They put out great stuff, especially on Iraq, on the Farhud. They've been doing a lot, and there's people there. There's someone else here in London. Maybe you follow. I know Rick over there was interviewed. Kira Shalom, if you know of her, the Mizrahi. She's great. I met her a few years ago. So those little stories, just interviewing Jews of, say, Sephardic or Mizrahi backgrounds, they can reach hundreds of thousands of people. And actually, by and large, he says that most of the responses are actually been really positive. And many people will message her and say they remember stories of their parents or grandparents telling them when Jews lived in these lands. And they kind of miss that coexistence. Those are really what I follow, or similar ones to that. But I think those are two great ones to start to learn more just on social media of, say, the Mizrahi, and to a lesser extent, the Sephardic stories.
Thank you very much, Isaac. Oh my gosh, it was such a tour de force. I couldn't keep up with making the notes, really. I have to ask you for the file of the presentation. But I have a kind of simple question because it popped into my mind. In my Polish education, at virtually no level of education, have I ever learned about Jewish traditions or who the Jews are. And I think this is the situation all over the place. And I just thought, why not try and somehow, I don't know how, maybe ISCAP could somehow be helpful with doing it, try and talk to national governments, because as far as I understand, just as you showed all the pogroms all the massacres, they stemmed from just a lack of knowledge about who the Jews are. And why not try and make, so maybe stupid of me to think it's possible, somehow try and make national governments teach obligatory lessons about who the Jews are. So this blood libel isn't passed to the next generation. But because all of those protests, what I was doing at my university, fighting at my university, it was so clear those people don't know anything about the Jews, anything about the history of the Jewish nation, and so forth. I don't know, just a thought. I don't know what can you say? Thank you so much.
Thanks for the comment, but I mean, we have the man right here, Charles, to talk to more about that idea. But I think there's something to it.
It's important. Yeah, it's very important. This is why I think Jewish consciousness begins to address it. Yeah, our anti-Semitism, as as Bob Dylan says, it's the world of lies, right? This is what we're dealing with. But it's very important what you say.
Thank you very much for the lecture on the history and so on. I noticed in the rundown of the histories, most of the concentrations of the details is on what we call a Nefusot Yehuda, that is the scattered of Yehuda. I didn't hear much of the Mizrahi Israel. There are two portions of it, Nefusot Yehuda, Mizrahi Israel. Most of the things, the contemporary things that happened is on Nefusot Yehuda. So the history now, the Mizrahi Israel, like things that happened in 722 BCE, 721 BCE, much of those things kind of skipped. And if you come down to it, you hear things about I will bring my people from beyond the rivers of Cush. And kind of maybe sparingly or wasn't mentioned. So when we are talking about the history of the Jews, we should make it a bit more comprehensive, because in all the maps you read, the cycle of the Jews were just going around the Mediterranean. And what we should know is that before the Jews around the Mediterranean, there were civilizations in Timbuktu. They had university there. So majority of the Jews were in Timbuktu, and that area was Songhai. And if I need to consider that that place is beyond the ring of the Mediterranean, that we'll keep saying Jews were distributed around the Mediterranean, Timbuktu is not the Mediterranean, and we're not capturing it in our history. Now it looks like there were no Jews in Timbuktu. Timbuktu was the foremost university in the world. And the Jewish university, and we're not talking about it. And from Timbuktu, Songhai Empire, down to Benin Empire and Ghana Empire. These are civilizations. So when we're talking about it, it looks like something about our people is not being captured and doesn't make it look comprehensive. So how do we make it better that we should capture the history of Mizrahi Israel and Nefusot Yehuda in our history? So we'll make it comprehensive. Thank you very much.
I mean, your point's incredibly well taken, and I think it's important that you're here and to speak on it. I, of course, had to limit what I could say, right, in a very limited amount of time to try to get right to some of the highlights of Sephardic and Mizrahi. But you're right. Just as the Sephardic and Mizrahi narratives are oftentimes been neglected, we have the other part, as you said, the Nidchei, the Israel, that already separated earlier, as you said, already in the 8th century. And it's important to include. Obviously I couldn't cover everything in one talk, but again, I'm also not an expert on it, but I am aware of that history, and time permitting, I could have gone more into it, but again, very important that you're here to speak on it in more detail. Thank you.
I'll just reiterate what you said. The reason why you're here is for this very reason. And I think many of us in the room care and know considerably about Jewish history, civilization, but many of us don't know about African Jewry. And I should say, I think, I'm a global kind of guy, and I know a few things about Jewish history, and we'll hear more next week, but I went to Lagos for Pesach about 4 or 5 years ago, and I had the honor of spending it with Kish and his congregation, and it blew my mind. A whole universe opened up to me, and I had no idea really soon before I went. And I actually believe in the next generation, this is a wild thing to say, I know, the demographics of the Jewish people is going to be revolutionized. And if you think about it, we were dispersed 2,000 years ago, and we didn't have internet and social media, thank God. Maybe there was, and I think for the first time, Jewish communities are capable of reconnecting because of the ability to communicate. And there are people that were disconnected, communities that have been disconnected for many centuries, if not millennium, which is wild. And there really is a profound connection to Israel by communities from Mali, from Ghana, from Nigeria, all through West Africa. We know, into Yemen and East Africa, Ethiopia, and further down. But West Africa is not widely known. And I'll just give you one thought. If we were all sitting in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago and the Romans are coming and they're invading and they're slaughtering and they're taking over, and we're sort of sitting around, saying, what do we do? Some people will say, well, let's get out of here, we'll go east. Some people will say, we're going to go south, we're going to go to North Africa, we'll go further down to Africa. And I'm saying, let's go to Europe. You'd probably look at me like, what the hell? This is where the enemy is coming from. We should run away. So think about it. We were really dispersed. And I think now we have this incredible opportunity to really reconnect. And I really think it's going to be revolutionary. But we have to hear each other for the first time in a long time, which is amazing.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. Isaac, what are your next steps, and will there be a legal dimension also answering some of the legal charges put against us?
When you say legal charges, you mean against?
In misuse of international law, or supposed international law.
Well, I mean, that's my other focus is the legal history and Nuremberg trials and atrocity crimes. I'm working on that too. I'm doing research on the Holocaust and Nuremberg. I'll actually be speaking in a few weeks, personally, for example, in Washington, D.C., on already how you see the framing of the narrative in some sense of the Holocaust already through the Nuremberg trials, through the prosecution already comes out. I think it's very important. This just further helps educate, I think, people. So I'm trying to do research in multiple areas, and there's a connection in the history, not just in Jewish history, but in the legal history, I think, between the Inquisition, the Holocaust, again, the purity of blood laws, which are eerily foreshadowing to some extent the Nuremberg racial laws. I've tried to actually find evidence. Could we say the Nazis were aware of the purity of blood laws? I've found very scarce stuff, but one thing seems to be fascinating to me, and that is, of course, we know the Nazis took a pathological interest in Jewish holidays, and they knew Jewish history, and there was an actual exhibit in Berlin at the Jewish Museum in 1937, so in Nazi Germany, on the 500th anniversary of the birth of Don Isaac of Abravanel, the great Sephardic Jew, the one who actually tried to prevent the Edict of Expulsion, then he left Italy. And we know that it's quite probable Adolf Eichmann visited the exhibit, as well as Carl Schmidt, the crown jurist of the Third Reich and a man involved in, I think, drafting the Nuremberg laws. They took an actual visit to the museum to see about the history of the Inquisition and Spanish Jewry.
So you have time for one more question. Gilad.
Thank you. Very quick ones. Firstly, in 1492, I understand some people did flee to Mali. So it's not only before, but also related to your talk. So they did flee to Timbuktu, and it's interesting to know whether they met some.
From Timbuktu after the fall of Songhai Empire, they went down further.
Right. So this is also 1492. I'm not talking about the 8th century. Now, my question is about Israel. Correct me if I'm wrong. In America, 70% are Ashkenazic Jews, or almost 70% among the Jews. So I can understand the Ashkenomativity, or whatever you want to call it. In Israel, most Jews are actually Mizrahim, not Ashkenazis. So, and it's interesting because of the Israelization of the diaspora, as we heard yesterday. But still, in Israel, you don't learn what you've just shown us.
No, you do.
You do?
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on it?
You do learn. You know about the Farhud. You study not that details, but I mean, for me it was not new, and
I'm talking about children.
No. So I mean, if I know it, so things I didn't study it in school, but now they talk about it. It's not only the Holocaust now. Although the Holocaust is like it's the main focus, but you do know about the Holocaust.
Do you know when it was changed?
No.
I just wonder whether you have a comment about the Israeli component. So I understand America is very Ashkenazi-centric. Israel today is less and less so. So do you expect some changes that might eventually also influence the diaspora, if we take what Yossi said yesterday about the Israelization of the diaspora? So in other words, the Sephardicization of the diasporic Jew when it comes to knowledge and etc. will actually come from Israel rather than from the diaspora.
That's a great point. I would agree. I mean, as I said, we've already started to see, I think, some changes in the United States in terms of how the history is taught. It's, again, not fast, it's not everywhere, but there are some changes happening. There seems to be more interest and at least a growing acceptance. So as I said, my kind of example, accepted by that one museum. And I think you're right. I mean, as more and more Jews also move to Israel, also the American Jewish population shrinks. We'll also start to see, I think, the growing influence of Israeli culture, Israeli educational models, I think, on American Jewry. And I'll just add, by the way, when I gave this talk to the other group, someone made a similar point about America is just so unique in that sense. It's so Ashkenazi that, I mean, vis-a-vis many other countries. And so America, in some sense, this relatively, say, historical lack of awareness is not the norm for global Jewish communities. But the change is coming, and I hope it continues. And so I guess this is it. Yes, Charles? I just want to say thank you, everyone. I'm actually leaving tomorrow, so I have to get back. I have a couple talks I have to give in the States, and so I can't stay the entire 2 weeks, but it's been an honor, privilege, and I'm happy to stay in touch. I'll give you my card if you'd like to. Perhaps we could collaborate in the future, and I look forward to seeing everyone again. I wish you the best of luck and an exceptional time here at ISGAP.
We really appreciate your intervention and your important work, so thanks for being here with us.
Thank you.
Next year you'll come the whole time.
Yeah.